What's up, everybody? Let's start out with this. This is a pretty cool video by Rude Awakening, like a straight up preacher guy. He's got this theory about Solomon's temple and what they did with the Ark of the Covenant. So the two front pillars are mentioned two different times, once before and after the sacking of the city. And he says that the pillar was 2 cubits shorter after the sack, and he went all Indiana Jones with it, where they busted out the sand and the pillars would sink down operating this lever that was on a trap door. And then they had this tunnel running out under the city walls to an underground chamber. Now, the tunnel and the chamber are there. This really does exist. That's not theory. There's all kinds of tunnels all through Jerusalem. He might have mentioned having an escape hatch out there somewhere, which would make a lot of sense. But archaeologists found this carving in the tunnel and took it out. That's what the little steel plaque is commemorating down at the bottom right. But it's of a winged sphinx thing. And it reminded me of what I read about the tabernacle in Exodus the other day. So I don't mean to mess with anybody's faith. If that's the case, just turn back now. But there's a lot of weird stuff in the Old Testament. And just remember, it was these guys that were the only ones that had access to this for hundreds of years in Latin. They're the ones that told you that the Father Jesus was referring to is the God of Moses in the Old Testament. So the first people that heard about Jesus didn't have an official text. It took a long time for that to all get written. And I know from the comments, different people can watch the exact same thing and take away two totally different ideas about what was being said. So I'm sure some of the things all depended on who you asked. So people had totally different ideas of what Christianity was, and Marcion, for one, was under the impression that the loving God that Jesus spoke of is not the same as the vengeful, wrathful God of the Old Testament. The one that sent snakes to bite the Hebrews for murmuring about wandering in the desert aimlessly with no water and genetically engineered smudge cakes called manna. But Marcion, the Gnostics, the Bogomils, the Cathars, and probably a few more all thought that the God of the Old Testament was not who Jesus was referring to. After all, he was constantly arguing with the Pharisees, and they were the ones that had him crucified. The Romans didn't want to. That being said, this is an artist's rendition of Inside of the Holy of Holies. This is inside Solomon's temple, and then we have the for sure Sphinx carving down in the tunnel below. So why do the children of the one true God have the same statues as all of the false gods of the surrounding areas? Everybody knows about the Egyptian Sphinx, but all throughout the region you have the same winged lions and even winged lions with winged people. And here's Horus. That dude's got to be 25 foot tall. Gilgamesh was a big boy too, holding a lion like a kitty cat. But everybody in the region has these for the old gods. So why would these be in a temple to the one true God? They look an awful lot like the false gods that God told them to stay away from. But evidently these are cherubs from the Bible. Some would say that this is just a symbolic representation of God's might, which I can understand. Got the body of a lion signifying strength, the head of a man signifying wisdom, and then wings because he could fly. But other people in the region had the same ideas about their false gods. So let's look at Psalms 18. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and did fly. Yea, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. Just going to transliterate this a bit, but around his pavilion were thick, dark clouds of the sky. And he shot out his arrows, lightning. So in just plain English, they're saying, yeah, he really did fly in this dark cloud that was so big it cast a shadow below him, the darkness at his feet. There was this loud thundering noise that shook the earth, and he shot out lightning and destroyed the enemies. And they use the term dark clouds around his pavilion. In the book of Job's, also, can any understand the spreading of the clouds or the noise of his tabernacle? And they make it clear that his tabernacle is up in the sky. In the book of Exodus, he leads them out of Egypt with a pillar of smoke during day and a pillar of fire at night that descends nightly on the tabernacle once they get to the point that they build it. Now, in building the Ark of the Covenant, he tells them to put 2 cherubim on top of it out of solid gold with their wings facing towards each other like a arc reactor or something. I'll talk about that in another video. But you got these winged creatures on the ark. And then with making the fabric for the tent of the tabernacle, he says to weave in all of these cherubim winged creatures into it. Which is all kind of weird considering they're not supposed to worship graven images, because these guys would basically just start worshiping anything for any reason. Moses was gone for a couple of weeks and they make and start worshiping a golden cow. And when God sent the poisonous snakes to bite all of them for murmuring, Moses asks for mercy and God tells him to make a bronze serpent and put it on a stick, which they would look upon and probably started worshiping. Which there's a lot of weird stuff with Moses and his staff too. He throws it down and it turns into a serpent in front of Pharaoh. He touches it to the Nile, the water turns to blood. He breaks a rock apart, water starts coming out. He uses it to part the Red Sea. Anyway, there's a lot of weird stuff in the Old Testament when you really look at it. But why is God telling these people that will basically worship anything at a drop of the hat to decorate with these winged creatures that are a lot like the Egyptian and Sumerian gods? And what that guy's holding is also known as the cosmic thunderbolt, which can be found Zeus, Odin, all these different gods. And we just talked about his flying tabernacle that thundered in the heavens and shot out lightning. Some other weird stuff. I did a whole 15-minute video on this. I tried 3 different edits and they wouldn't let me run it. Not without age restriction for some reason, which is a bad thing. That's usually one step before getting a stirk. But there is no star in the Bible associated with David. But there are 2 references. You've borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, the star of your god, which you made yourselves. And then in Acts, the star of your god Remphan. So Moloch and Remphan are both associated with Saturn and the old school Saturn worship. This is also associated with the seal of Solomon, which controlled demons. And everybody knows this is on a certain flag today, which might have been the problem with the original video I made on this. But Solomon gave himself up to Saturn worship, built altars to Asheroth and Moloch, and this seal of Solomon was used in Egyptian magic and witchcraft. David had absolutely nothing to do with the hexagram, and the star most certainly didn't represent God's people. But the Bible is full of instances of the Hebrews turning away from God, worshiping other gods, and it seems to me like these stories got intertwined and intermixed. I mean, Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt, so that could certainly account for the Sphinx similarities. Another story that I've heard from multiple sources, but a great source on this is David Litwa on the right here. He did some videos with Gnostic Informant, Myth Vision podcast. 2 great channels if you're into this kind of thing. But a story by Manassius says that there was an attack on the temple, and this was a much later date, but they went into the Holy of Holies and came out with a huge golden donkey head. Now, even the high priests only went into the Holy of Holies once a year, and nobody else was allowed to. But in another story, this guy, Zechariah, he becomes a high priest, and he goes into the temple, and there's all of this incense burning, and it's really smoky, and he can barely see. And then finally, this big head of a golden donkey pops out to him, and he freaks out. He runs outside and wants to yell to everybody that, do you guys realize we're worshiping a donkey in there? But then he's struck dumb and can't talk. Now, you ready for this? You know what other god has a donkey's head? The Egyptian god Set. And Set was kind of this dark evil, I don't know if evil's the right word, but dark god, the god of chaos, war, and storms. So once again, we're back to the lightning, cosmic thunderbolt motif. And if you guys want to hear a really weird, kind of disgusting story, look up the trial of Set and Horus. It's a little too X-rated for here. But two components of this is one, Isis cutting off Horus's phallus, which is thrown into a pot of ointment to remain stiff, and it's symbolized by the obelisk. And another aspect is Set gouging out the eyes of Horus. More specifically, the left eye, which I'm sure you've heard of. Horus was having a bad day. And if you read the actual story, it's a very S&M kind of disgusting affair. Anyway, there's a lot of things about the Old Testament that your preacher ain't never going to tell you about. And like I said, every time you turn around, the Hebrews were worshiping a different God. And if this is upsetting to anyone as a Christian, I'll just say this. Would it really be the worst thing to find out that the loving God that Jesus spoke of was not the same vengeful, wrathful God of the Old Testament? I'm not trying to be one of those false prophets that are spoken of, but a thorough reading and some research of the Old Testament, which they tell you don't ever question anything, reveals a lot of weird stuff. But I think that's enough for now. Static out.